Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs, and in today's episode I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about the Russian ruble. But before we get started on all of that, I just want to address the fact that I'm down at the beach again and I'm not holding the camera, but it may be moving around a little bit because it's really windy today. So I'm sitting in a bar at the moment. I'll just give you a quick swizz round to show you the environment. So this is where I'm sitting. It's a beach bar. It's not open at the moment. It's a bit early in the morning. So I'm just taking shelter here really to make sure that it's not too windy, because when I was standing on the beach a couple of minutes ago you couldn't really hear the vocals. There was a lot of noise from the wind. And I just want to address a few issues because I've been asking for your feedback, and the feedback that I've had so far has been really positive. I think generally speaking this concept of going out and about is quite popular, so I'm definitely going to continue it. There's been some feedback. People have been asking me what this insect is on my chest. This is actually the mic, and this furry part here is to cut down the noise from the wind to try to make the audio as good as possible. I've also had feedback about these things, the sunglasses. People have been saying, take them off, I don't like not seeing your eyes, so I'll take them off. The reason I was wearing them is that it was really, really bright. As you can see, it's a little bit cloudy today, so it's not as bad. So I'll try and do this one without having the sunglasses on to keep everybody happy. I know it's impossible to keep everybody happy. And the reason that I wanted to post this video today is that following on from the increase in the sanctions, specifically targeting what's happening with the ruble, Russia is now finding it increasingly more difficult to actually be paid. And this represents a major problem for an economy that is solely based on its exports. I'm just trying to steady the camera a bit because I can see that it's moving around a little bit. So as I reported in a recent video, Russia is now being paid the majority of its export revenue in Chinese yuan. And this is because nobody wants to deal in the Russian ruble. And I'll come on to talk about the fact that I believe that the Russian ruble is actually now a dead currency. It's becoming something that nobody apart from Russia wants to use. And over the past 6 months or so, we have seen those sanctions being really clamped down upon. The USA in December 2023 introduced a new regime whereby they were threatening any institution that was found to be dealing with Russian entities with secondary sanctions. And as we've talked about before, secondary sanctions are basically the same as the sanctions that are being applied against Russia. So if you're found to be dealing with an entity that's been sanctioned, then you are subject to the same sanctions. And from China's point of view, that's an absolute disaster, because only 5% of China's total trade is being done with Russia. In fact, it's less than 5%. So Chinese businesses and Chinese financial institutions simply can't run the risk of being hit with those secondary sanctions, because that's going to damage more than 95% of their business, which is obviously the vast majority. So these secondary sanctions are now starting to hit home. And in June 2024, there was an increase in those sanctions because prior to that period, some of the smaller institutions, the smaller Chinese banks, were still evading the sanctions. They were basically setting up institutions on the region between China and Russia and making all of the payments. But the USA and the other countries from the West are now closing in on all of those institutions. And what that's meant is that they're now having to stop the payments. They're having to double and triple check all of the entities that they're dealing with in Russia. And this has now meant that the flow of cash into Russia is now stopping. So Russia is finding it very difficult to be paid for its exports. So it's one thing agreeing a big trade deal to move large quantities of oil or natural gas. But the problem from Russia's point of view is that if you're not being paid for that, obviously you don't want to continue that supply arrangement, because there comes a point when you simply run out of capital. And that's what's happening to a lot of Russian businesses at the moment. They're really struggling to be paid. And it's now also affecting imports for Russia, because Russia is now sourcing the vast majority of all of its imports directly from China. And obviously, if Russian companies who are making those imports can't actually make the payment to their Chinese counterparts, then at some point those imports are going to stop as well. And in its official report for July 2024, the Russian central bank actually said that the amount of revenue that Russia is now earning from its exports is falling, and it's now becoming more and more dependent on domestic production and demand. And what that means is that Russia's wartime economy is now becoming even more important to the economy of Russia. And we've talked about this in other videos, but basically what this means is that the Kremlin is now sponsoring thousands of different companies in Russia to produce things to continue the war in Ukraine. So it's paying all of those companies directly. Those companies are now totally dependent on that income coming directly from the Kremlin. So it's becoming less of a global player and more of an internal economy in Russia. So we've got two things that are starting to happen to the Russian economy. Firstly, nobody wants to deal in the ruble, and so it's having to resort to things like the Chinese yuan for both payments for its exports, but also paying for things where it's actually importing things from China. It's now paying China in Chinese yuan. So the ruble is becoming less and less important as a global currency. But also, Russia is now reducing the amount that it's importing and exporting, and it's becoming quite isolated from the rest of the world. So the sanctions are having a massive impact on the Russian economy. If you follow mainstream media, you could get sucked into thinking that the sanctions aren't actually very effective, because you see headlines like Russia is due to grow faster than the USA and the rest of the West in 2024. Its GDP is outstripping everybody else, and it's doing really well in terms of becoming a high-income economy. They're two headlines that I've seen recently, and lots of people have posted comments saying, "What are you talking about, Joe Blogs? You're talking nonsense. You keep telling me that the sanctions are working, and I'm reading these headlines saying Russia's doing better than everybody else." But all of these things are relative, because Russia is coming from a lower base, because its GDP fell in 2022 and only increased slightly in 2023. So it's coming from that lower standpoint. But also, GDP is not the only metric. When you just look at GDP, it can be very misleading. You have to take a look at what's happening across the whole economy. And in Russia, they've got some serious problems. Inflation has been rising over the past 8 or 9 months and is now into double figures. Interest rates are sitting at 16%, which is one of the highest levels out of all of the countries in the G20. The only countries that have higher interest rates at the moment are Turkey and Argentina, and obviously they're both in a state of economic crisis, and if you want to find out more about that, check out the videos that I've been posting on both of those countries. So Russia is definitely struggling. It's becoming less involved with the rest of the world. It's now having to focus more on its own internal production and payments. And at some point, that economy will implode, because you can't become self-circling. You can't just pay yourself for making things and then make those things and then pay yourself some more, because you need to be able to fund that. And the only way that Russia is funding it at the moment is from its reserves. And as we've talked about before, those reserves are reducing. Over 300 billion of reserves have been frozen by the West at the time of the invasion of Ukraine. And those reserves are now being used for bonds that are going to be given to Ukraine to help in its defence. So Russia doesn't have access to that 300 billion, and the remaining 300 billion, which was held in gold and other forms, has been reducing over the last 2 years, because Russia has been dipping into it to keep the war effort going. So all of that is really bad news from Russia's point of view. But the other point that I made earlier in the video about the ruble is really important, because the amount of trade that Russia is doing in rubles has diminished drastically since the start of the war. At the start of the war, Russia was doing somewhere in the region of 50% of its trade in rubles. And the reason that it was doing that, because it was demanding that countries paid it in rubles. However, over the last 2 years, there has been a huge reduction in the amount of business being done in rubles, predominantly because Russia's two major trading partners, China and India, are refusing to do business in rubles. So China will only deal in the Chinese yuan, and that's improving the attractiveness of the yuan globally. Other countries are now accepting payments in yuan from Russia. So Russia's now receiving payments from China for all of the oil and other things it's selling to it, and it's now using some of that yuan to pay other countries. But also India has refused to deal in the ruble as well. Initially it wanted to deal in Indian rupees. Unfortunately, Russia then became overwhelmed with rupees because it doesn't do a lot of reciprocal trade with India. So it couldn't use all of those rupees to buy things from India, and nobody else wanted to deal in rupees. So the two countries are now dealing in yuan and United Arab Emirates dirhams. So none of this is good news for the ruble, and what we are seeing is the death of the ruble. It's becoming a dead currency. Nobody, apart from Russia, wants to deal in it. And the only countries today that are still dealing in Russian ruble are basically those countries that don't have a choice. So countries such as Belarus, Venezuela and Cuba, who are being forced to deal in rubles, are still dealing, but everybody else is walking away from it. And that's bad news for Russia, because generally speaking, the strength of your currency equates to the strength of your economy. When your economy is doing well, people want to trade with you, therefore they need your currency, they buy your currency, it increases in value. However, if nobody wants to trade with you and nobody wants to deal in your currency, the value of your currency falls. And that's exactly what's been happening to the Russian ruble over the last 2 years and is likely to continue happening. Now you might be sitting there thinking, hang on a minute, the Russian ruble has stabilised, it's worth 90 to $1. And that's what the official exchange rate says. However, the volume of trade in rubles has reduced dramatically since the start of the war in Ukraine. And basically what we are seeing is a sham market. Russia is manipulating that value. It's restricted the amount of rubles that some of the companies in Russia can actually trade in. They're being forced to actually deal in rubles, convert foreign currency back into rubles to keep that value up. And also the central bank in Russia is buying rubles to keep it at the level that it wants to be at. So basically the exchange rate for the Russian ruble isn't something that you can rely upon right now because it's not being freely traded. It's not like the US dollar or the euro where there are huge volumes of trade. The volume of trade in rubles is so low that it's almost becoming irrelevant. So the overall summary of today's video is over the last 2.5 years, the Russian ruble has become less and less relevant as an international currency. And particularly over the last 6 months, we have seen a ramping up of the sanctions against Russia, and particularly in payments. That's meaning now that Russia is struggling to be paid in any currency, not just in rubles, but also in Chinese yuan, because the institutions that are dealing with Russian entities are running the risk of secondary sanctions, and that is a big risk to take if you're dealing predominantly with the rest of the world. So Russia is now in a situation where nobody wants to use its currency, and now people are struggling to be able to make payments to and from Russia. And that is going to be really problematic in terms of the level of trade. It means that Russia is also now focusing even more on its wartime economy, and that is not a sustainable position because that will drain Russia's reserves, and at some point those reserves will run out. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. You've enjoyed the time at the beach. Let me show you a quick run around here. It's still quite early. There are some people around. It's a bit cloudy today. It's still warm, but it is a bit breezy. But it's a nice day still. It's very pleasant. So I've enjoyed doing these videos down at the beach. I think I will keep up this concept of going outside of the Joe Blog studio because it's popular amongst the viewers, amongst you guys, but also it's more fun for me. It's nice to get out and about. I do have to do a bit more prep before the video and then trying to remember everything that I've been talking about and trying to include everything in the video, which isn't that easy, but I'm enjoying the challenge of doing that. Hopefully you're enjoying it too and you've enjoyed today's video, and here's something to put a smile on your face.